everyone. Thank you all so much for joining us today for another Vision Chat at Johns Hopkins. This is a session or a program that we've started to try to envision the future and what's happening in the future with professionals and leaders and colleagues from all around the country. Today, I have with me three dear friends and colleagues and leaders and movers and shakers. So first, I'd like to introduce Wahab Owalabi, who is the founder of URX. He's also, URX stands, by the way, for University Recruiting X, and you get to define that. And so he'll tell you a little bit more about it today. He's also a diversity business partner at Facebook. We're fortunate to have Jason Weingarten, who is the CEO and co-founder of Yellow. And back for a third time, we never get sick of her, and we love having her here. Gara, who is the VP of Higher Education and Student Success and Handshake. And I am Farouk Day, VP of Integrated Learning and Life Design at Johns Hopkins, and I am super excited to have you with us today. Listen, it's going to be a great conversation today, but I want to start first by pointing out the tragedy that is all around us and to just take a moment to acknowledge that. Or today we are at over 3 million cases worldwide of COVID-19, over 1 million cases in the United States. Unfortunately, over 60,000 people have lost their lives in the United States as a result of COVID-19. That's a lot of people and a lot of families and loved ones who are connected to those people, and we keep them all in our thoughts and prayers. There is certainly a profound public health impact as a result of COVID-19, but there is also a profound economic impact. Just yesterday, it was announced that the GDP in the United States retracted by 4.8%, and we are looking at probably some of the highest unemployment rates we have seen in our recent history. Some economists are pointing to even 15%. And this is also impacting college graduates, college students who are seeking internships, who are looking at practical experiences. And they're going to have certainly a tough summer ahead and a tough year if they're graduating. But at the same time, I think what you will find in our conversation today is that the four of us have hope for the future and are seeing silver linings and are seeing opportunities for people to pivot and to build new strategies, for all of us to do our work differently in order to change towards the future. If there's one thing that is certain, is that we're not going back to the way it was. We're not going back to normal. There's going to be a new normal, and we're going to have to create it. And the sooner we look at it that way, the faster we get to that new normal, and we get to start to see those opportunities for change. So the one thing that is on my mind, Wahab, Christine, and Jason, is internships. That's been on my mind the last couple of days, especially because I started to see a trend downwards where perhaps 2 or 3 weeks ago, we were thinking that companies were holding on to the idea of keeping interns and then perhaps moving them to a virtual setting, but we're seeing the numbers dwindle down now. So nationally, according to NACE, we're now at 40% of companies and organizations that are revoking offers overall. And we're having a lot of students who had offers that have been rescinded or just cannot find an opportunity. And even if they can find an opportunity, it's not clear how they're going to do it this summer. What are you all hearing? What are you all seeing? And what are some of your ideas for how to move forward? How about we start with Wahab? What are you hearing, and then we'll go from there.
Yeah, I mean, so I think URX is a community of university recruiters, technical recruiters, and people passionate about diversity and inclusion. And one of the biggest things that I think that we saw was this big rush to switch from on-site internship to remote virtual internships. And I don't think that we were actually prepared as a recruiting community to do that, because it wasn't something that we necessarily had to do in bulk. And the last survey we ran, which was last week, we actually saw a decrease. So we saw 8% of the people that are in our community ended up canceling, but over 80% of folks made that transition. Now, predominantly the people in our community are from tech companies, so those type of roles generally lend itself better to remote work. So I think the learning for me is that when forced and sort of this unfortunate situation created this opportunity, companies quickly figured it out, right? And in the future, you know, this is now part of the toolbox. And I think that's some of the silver lining, that you can decide, hey, we don't necessarily have to have folks on site to provide these experiences and these opportunities. And it might open up more opportunities for more students in the future once things sort of, hopefully, we know we get to the other side of this.
Mm-hmm.
Interesting. Christine, what are
one of the, go ahead. Christine, after you.
Oh, no, it's okay, Jason, go ahead.
So we're all too polite here. So one of the things that I've been in this space for those that don't know me for 22 years now. I founded eCampus Recruiter back in '99 and 2000. It's now owned by Simplicity, and saw 2008 take place where students had internships and everything was absolutely fine. And then in a heartbeat, they were gone. I remember hearing that Lehman Brothers, don't worry, all the internships are going to be all fine, right? And then Lehman Brothers disappeared. And so when we founded Yellow in later that year, founded under the premise of make sure you understand who you're getting the information from, and make sure that the people you are getting the information from have participated in crisis management. And so when we started polling people 4 or 6 weeks ago, we discounted heavily anyone who had not specifically talked about being in crisis management meetings, because the data that they had was a gut. It wasn't based off of what was happening at a higher level. And so when we started polling folks, we were able to see very quickly that it was going to be a heavy virtual environment for those companies that were able to make that shift. And those that couldn't, we're looking at focusing more on virtual training instead of a virtual employment experience. And I think those companies will do really well. Totally agree with Wahab that there's going to be more opportunities for remote internships. I don't think that they'll need to be over the summer. I think that there's a lot of new opportunities that this will spark, and I'm excited about that for our wonderful industry.
I'll jump in. I think I'll look at this actually from a slightly different angle. What we're seeing from students as they sort of experience this different type of economic downturn, as they look at sort of the landscape of what's available in terms of internships as well as full-time jobs, we're seeing more flexibility and agility sort of being shown by our students in what they're willing to do, right? So we saw an increase of almost 13 points of students who are now willing to consider gig work or part-time work as a result of sort of what is happening right now. I think the gig work is up to about 69% of students are more than willing to actually consider sort of freelance projects or project-based work. And I think that's been another way that, although some internship programs have had to be canceled or have sort of shifted, it doesn't mean that those employers are not able to still hire contractors in some cases, or they're able to hire folks on a project sort of basis. They just might not call it the same internship program. And so we're seeing some shifts there. And it's actually, I think, a really good sign that this generation in particular is starting to embrace the notion of work could just simply look very different than the way that we have talked about it in the past. And so I think that's definitely something that we want to continue to encourage in terms of that type of mindset, that agility, that nimbleness. I think that's a lot of Farouk, obviously, stuff that we've talked about in the past before. And I think it's going to serve this generation well, because I think the reality is that's exactly sort of what the future will look like. But to Jason and Wahab's point, there are still opportunities out there. And I know, at least on our end, we just updated our list of companies that are hiring on Handshake. We just added another 250 to that list just a few days ago. And so there's absolutely still opportunities out there, both for internships and full-time opportunities. They just might be in areas or might be with companies that students were not as familiar with before, or look a little bit different in terms of roles. So it's all about flexibility right now.
Yeah, I think, Christine, I think those are like really good points. And, one of the things that we've seen in URX in particular is that the role of a university recruiter, the role just of, what is the university recruiting industry and that collaboration between companies and the universities, I believe it's changing and probably changing for the better. When this pandemic hit, we saw the recruiters in our community really shift from, hey, I have an opportunity for you, let's take you through this process, to like counseling students through this, supporting students through this, right along with their university partners. And I've been really advocating that it's really not university recruiting as much as it is talent development, talent programs. So when you think about interns and internships, and you mentioned sort of like the gig economy and how it's coming into the picture here, the big thing that I think the companies are starting to realize is this is a talent pipeline that they can create that is sort of, frankly, more cost effective than an internship, like a traditional internship. And you can reach more students, you can reach more people, right? So if the goal of any internship program from a company's perspective is to create a pipeline of talent that will convert to full-time, right? You're in a better position if I can reach and get connected with 1,000 students over the course of 12 months versus, let's say, 200 or 300 over the course of 3 months. Those are new opportunities that our companies are starting to realize. And then the recruiters are now in a position where they're maintaining relationships over a longer period of time with these students.
That's exactly right. Farouk, what are you seeing in terms of what your students are worried about? Are many of them being flexible? I would imagine that much of your staff is probably helping them to think a little bit differently about what's possible and what's out there. And I don't know if you've had your hiring week yet, but did that already happen as well? And how did that turn out?
So we're having our hiring week at the end of May. I asked my team specifically, and some of them might be listening today. I said, we are not doing a virtual career fair. Do you hear me? We're not doing a virtual career fair. And the reason for that is because we need, whatever we do needs to have high impact right away and a high likelihood for actual hiring action to happen, not just meeting and exchanging resumes. So we have an incredible, talented executive director of our Higher Hopkins office, new office that we established this last year, Aliyah Punawala, who comes from industry, so she was already thinking that way. And she created a full week of hiring week, matching directly students with employers. We were able to get over 30 companies with over 240 jobs that were brought to us specifically for our students, and we are going to essentially do the matching between our students and those companies. And the numbers work out just right, because when we sent a survey to our students to inquire about the impact of COVID-19, that's one of the first things we did, is we wanted to trace the impact, just like scientists are tracing COVID-19 cases. We wanted to trace that, so we did a survey, and it continues to go on. We were able to immediately identify that we have about 300 to 400 students who are really concerned about, either because they haven't found anything yet, or because they had offers that were revoked or rescinded. So we're matching those students and employers. They're going to have interviews, and our hope is that all of that will result into hiring action. So that's one of the innovative things that we're trying to do to overcome these challenges on behalf of our students. What we are seeing from the survey that we have sent to all of our undergraduate students and graduate students is that these students are, so overall the numbers match what we see nationally. I think nationally 15% of students are saying that they had their offers revoked. We are, with our seniors, we are just under that, but we're somewhere in that ballpark. And students are incredibly forgiving. Like, they're saying, like, we understand the economy is just not good. So they're saying that in the survey, and they're asking for our help. But then also they're starting to pivot to other alternatives. And I'm personally conducting a bunch of Zoom meetings with different groups of students from my campus, but also from students in other campuses to try to understand how they're reacting. And there is an interest in trying out their startup ideas. So interest in entrepreneurship is higher, certainly percentage-wise within Johns Hopkins, but I'm seeing it also just anecdotally from these qualitative, informal qualitative study that I'm doing. There's interest in doing something for the community, so community social impact and community service. And there are people who are just interested in investing their time in different projects. And they would love to take on these small micro projects that you mentioned, Christine. I think that could be the way forward. They understand that they can't have an internship, or they might not have an internship the way they envisioned it. But if they can try to build something for a company, for an organization, for a small period of time, that might work out. So one way we're using that information at Hopkins is we're doubling down on the awards that we're giving to students for their startup ideas, for research, undergraduate research. We're trying to figure out, we're rethinking how we can reconfigure student employment on campus and turn many of those into internships, possibly virtual internships. So that's one way we can try to help out. And but these students understand they are ready for alternatives. I think I saw someone on.
Hey, Farouk. No, I mean, I think that those are like really good points, and you know, I'm curious, like from a university standpoint, how you think about helping students upskill, you know, over the summer, right? Like if we think about the internship, it's about upskilling, it's about experience, and universities sort of inherently have this infrastructure in place that while, you know, during the core academic year, you're really thinking about curriculum, you're thinking about different courses that you're taking. Is there an opportunity for universities to think more about, hey, let's prepare you to become a software engineer over the course of this summer. Hey, let's prepare you to become a product manager, a product marketer over the course of this summer through our university offering, which is very different than, hey, let me prepare you to pass this, you know, or learn the fundamentals of computer science. Like becoming a software engineer is a very different thing than sort of acing your computer science 101 or, you know, class. Have you all thought about that at all?
Yeah, I mean the skill development through maybe like a boot camp type of program is I know something that we've talked about. We don't have a solution for it yet, but it needs to be built out. But I agree with you that it's something that I think higher education could easily pivot into during this time and potentially use that to transform what higher education is about. You know, higher ed has always been sort of at a friction point with this very concept of higher ed for skill development that isn't for industry sake versus for, you know, liberal arts knowledge creation. And I don't think that there needs to be a friction point, but I think we might be at a moment where we might pivot towards that and possibly never come back. What do you think, Wow.
Well, I mean, I agree with you, right? So I graduated from a liberal arts college, and you know, I think the biggest thing that I took away is that universities sort of overall prepare you for life. At least that's the intention that most universities and most people who attend four-year traditional colleges, you know, get out of it, at least for positive experiences. And I don't think there should be friction between having a charter that's, hey, we're going to, you know, try to transform you and try to prepare you for life, as well as prepare you for a career, right? And they're intertwined, right? And I think that they can really coexist within the infrastructure of a university, whether it's on-site or virtual during this time.
Yeah, I think this whole topic is really fascinating because I think it opens up the door to really rethink what higher education can sort of look like. And I know there have been obviously lots of leaders that have been writing about it. Paul LeBlanc from Southern New Hampshire is certainly one of the leading forefront individuals that has sort of talked about how the models of what higher education could be really needed to shift before COVID-19. It probably really needs to shift now as we consider what this could look like. And I know Goldie, many of you are probably familiar with Goldie, who's one of the reporters at the Chronicle. I know she's thinking about a really great event or possible interview between folks in the university space as well as in the employer space. Actually, Wahab, to talk about exactly your question to Farouk is sort of what does that skill building look like how could each party, each end, do that better and actually do it better in collaboration with each other. So I know I'm really excited to hear more about that as Goldie puts that together. And I think it's going to be really fascinating. What's been really interesting is actually following what schools are thinking about doing for the fall. And right now there's obviously a ton of conversation about whether or not they're going to reopen, whether they'll delay, whether they're going to do all online. And then obviously some schools have chosen to do sort of block scheduling or modules in how they do their classes. And Colorado College has actually always been one of the unique institutions that has structured their classes in terms of just individual classes for a short period of time, and then they move on to the next one. And in some ways, they're so well set up to be really agile in this moment, because we don't know what's going to happen in terms of the pandemic, in terms of vaccines, all of that, but they're still allowing learning to continue to move forward. And so the last vision chat we had, I think I ended on a note about where I see faculty and how they could play a larger role. And I think, again, I'll just go there one more time in case there are any faculty on this particular call, but I think there's such great opportunity for us to make sure that we get our academic colleagues into industry on a regular basis to see what's happening. And more importantly, for both industry and academia to actually see that what's being learned, the theory behind what's happening, all of that academic work could actually really help fuel a lot of really amazing research and development in industry, and at the same time give the academic faculty a really clear idea of how to actually apply what it is they're teaching, and to be able to use that and weave that into their curriculum and into their conversations with students, I think would actually help build the types of skill sets that we need, and could actually help bridge that tension that doesn't need to exist. So the students are learning, but they're also being prepared for what they might go on to do. So anyway, I love this topic. I think it's very exciting, and I think there's a lot of potential for what could happen.
I wonder if Christine, I think those are great. Oh, sorry, Jason, go ahead.
Yeah, I've been talking about this for a while, where I think there's a disconnect between higher education and the amount it costs to attain the higher education. And I think you all bring up great points of how faculty can play different parts, how we can prepare perhaps more students at less expensive, just if you're doing it virtually, obviously it's going to be less expensive. Will it be as effective? That's still something we're all trying to understand. But one of the shifts that I believe will happen is that many students are starting to talk about either taking a skip year or gap year, I'm sorry, instead of going to a large university. They're a bit worried about it. And so I believe that going to community colleges, typically for 1 or 2 years, to start getting lower cost education before transferring into standard 4-year public or private universities, that's a trend that I think is going to, I think it was going to happen. I think that's the trend that will be much faster. And that's something that I think is going to change the face of university recruiting, as more and more of yellow customers are trying to find high school seniors.
I think we lost
Jason.
Jason.
Am I back?
Yes, you're back. You
All right, sorry about that.
And that's okay.
Yada, yada, everything's great.
No, you stopped, so go ahead, if that helps you.
Apologies. So the theory is that yellow customers typically are now going after high school seniors and students that are just getting into 4-year universities, with potential use of gap year, with more students, I believe, starting to look at community colleges based off of economics. I think it's going to change the face of university recruiting for a decade. And so I think this is going to happen a lot faster now.
Very, very, yeah, that sounds really interesting. Wahab, you were about to say something before Jason.
No, I mean, it's just on the point of that, sort of how we think about collaborating with professors. You know, Before joining Facebook, I ran talent programs at a startup, Rubrik. It's one of the fastest enterprise companies in Silicon Valley. And it was really interesting. You know, it was a very core distributed systems based sort of technology that we were working on. And one of the things that I did was really just think about, like, what are the universities where for them distributed systems and the technologies that Rubrik is working on are core and fundamental, and really just reaching out to those professors and providing that opportunity to say, hey, what you're working on, the deep learning that you're doing is like fundamental to what we're building here. Can you connect with some of our engineering leaders? Would you be open to connecting with our founder and CEO, things like that? And so the reaction and response from professors really ran the gamut. And I think to Christine's point, like, if professors just as a whole became a little bit more open to their curriculum being influenced by industry trends, I think we would be better off for it. But I would also say that, like, on the employer side, on the industry side, you know, the onus isn't just on the professors. Like, we as an industry, as employers, we have to also come to the table and really be positive partners in this, right? So to me, it's not, hey, change your curriculum or, you know, sort of do what industry says you should do. It's more about, hey, let's try to curate this curriculum together. And, you know, perhaps there are certain classes that are really specific to industries, right? So I want to say that I've seen some universities come up with different coursework that is really geared towards specific industries. And I'd love to see more of that. So it's not necessarily changing your fundamental CS courses or business courses. It's about new offerings that include, you know, very specific, hey, my ambition is to be a product marketer, or hey, my ambition is to be an investment banker, hey, my ambition is to be an entrepreneur, founder, CEO, etc., and having offerings that are geared specifically towards that, and professors who are trained to be able to deliver that curriculum as well.
So I mean,
how do they know they want to be a product manager? Like, I didn't even, I've run 2 companies now. I didn't even know product management was a thing until, you know, 5-6 years ago, right?
Yeah, I mean, so that's a great point,
think,
Jason. That's a great question, Jason, right? And I think to be frank, you know, how does somebody know that they wanted to major in computer science, right? They showed up on campus as a freshman, and, you know, they've seen things in the industry, and they've said, oh, okay, CS, that's a great degree to pursue, right? So product management is the same. It's the same thing. If you show up on campus as a freshman and you see a course offering and you're like, oh, there's a course on how to become a product manager, what does that mean, right? Like, there's information that's given to you, there's counseling, there's infrastructure built in to provide that guidance and open people's worlds to that. Like, I take my own experience, for example, where, you know, Farouk actually knows this, but I had a Twitter account before I knew that, you know, I could actually, like, pursue working at Twitter. Like, those two things didn't connect for me because I was never exposed to technology in that industry. And when I was exposed to it, it really opened my world. And so part of that, to your point, is that we should be exposing folks to the functional opportunities and career paths that they have available to them. And the earlier we do that, the more successful that students can be.
So this is a really good moment right now for us to that we're going through that potentially could change the face of college recruiting for forever, right? How are you seeing it happening? College recruiting is the pipeline between higher education and industry. That's that's how you go get your talent from universities into great opportunities. And how it's been done traditionally has been completely disrupted by COVID-19. Maybe it needed to be disrupted. Where is it going? What's happening now? Where is it going now? And I'm asking this particularly because I'm tracking all of the questions in the chat, and they all seem to ask similar questions around how do we do it now? How do we establish this connection? Because even though there are economic challenges, there are still lots of opportunities. You know, 500 companies were recruiting on Handshake, as Christine said, and then they just added 200. Lots of connections happening at Yellow also, and on other platforms. And also there are economic sectors that are more in demand now than others. But the actual transaction in between has been potentially broken by COVID-19. And we're in the process of figuring out how to rebuild it. What does it look like moving forward? In the immediate future, because we have a lot of students and employers who need to find each other in this new fog that we found ourselves in, but also in the future. Who wants to take a stab at that?
Well, I think these things have already transpired, right? Like I'm thinking about last year at NACE, one of our customers, Kearney, they completely went virtual without stepping foot on a single undergraduate campus. They were able to complete all of their recruiting activities. They were able to, according to their assessments, get better and more diverse talent than they had before, and were able to do that with fairly good cost savings. So I do believe that there are still going to be opportunities to be in front of students, because Gen Z is still making a significant decision based off of who they know and which recruiter they trust. And as long as those things that continue to stay faced, how you source, you know, maybe it's at a career fair, maybe it's not. And that's absolutely fine. But as far as being able to spread the net, that's something that large enterprises are doing, regardless of if they can make it physically to campus or not. And that will absolutely continue to happen.
I'll jump in and just say, I think when we're looking at the disruption that's happening in recruiting, I think it really is truly about mindset on all parties, right? And I know I keep going back to that point, but it really is at the core of how we think about the future. Farouk, you said something recently on, I think, one of your Twitter posts, and I just want to call this out because I think it's a huge difference between how some individuals are still approaching what's happening right now and how others have started to shift. I think there are some that are still reacting to what is happening. And I think there are others that are kind of maybe in the middle and they're responding to sort of what's happening. There is a difference between reacting and responding. And then I think there are others that are now moving forward towards shaping and actually crafting what that future can look like. And the reality is the future is here, right? We've been writing about some of this stuff for a really long time. And the fact is it's here, and we need to think differently about that. So there's sort of fall recruiting, which I know a lot of people on this call are deeply sort of worried about, and they're considering what are the changes that are happening for the fall. And then there's sort of recruiting beyond that in terms of what is it going to look like from here on out? What are some of these shifts that are actually going to sort of take hold? So I think if you break that down, there are probably a few different aspects or elements that I think we could think about. I think the first is to actually ask ourselves, what is the value that we are trying to create for our students and for our employers, right? I think instead of, and Farouk, we actually quoted you on this in our new blog post about sort of how we're rethinking sort of the next generation of virtual fairs. You can't just slap virtual on top of something and call it done, right? Because it's not necessarily going to replicate or have the same impact that you were looking for. Instead, you have to actually do your research and look back into what is the value that you are trying to create. And then you actually craft an experience around that value proposition, which is very, very different than necessarily what had happened before. And I think it's asking those questions. And I know they're not easy questions, and I know they take time and they require everybody to be a little bit creative or flexible. But I think when you do that, you also eliminate what I would say is fear. And I think the reality is there's a lot of people who have a lot of fear about the unknown. And anytime you don't know something or you don't fully understand something, I see a lot of people immediately go to this place of like skepticism or cynicism or fear. And they think there's something shady. They think there's something wrong. They're unsure about it. And I'm quite fascinated about that. And partially because I spend all day with my 7-year-old son, who's also in my house right now, while we're trying to work and go to school. And there's so much that he is experiencing every day that is new for him. And he doesn't approach it from a place of fear. He approaches it from a place of curiosity. And somewhere along the way as adults, we lost some of that. And so I would encourage us as a field and as a profession of early talent, you know, individuals and professionals to get back to that place where we can actually look at things to see the possibility and to embrace sort of that curiosity and what could be in whatever it is we're creating, rather than just being fearful of what is out there. And so I think that's a really important piece. I know that's very abstract it's a little bit sort of, you know, on probably more the kind of inspirational end, but I think it's really important while we're in the midst of talking about some of these tactical pieces to not lose that core at sort of the basis of our value and what that means for our students and our employers.
Yeah,
and then we can talk about
plus one, like Christine, plus one on that. I mean, I think that you make some really good points, and, you know, just going back to the way that recruiters and companies are coming together to support students through this. You know, the biggest thing I would say is that, you know, there's sort of like the short term, you know, how do we help students through this moment, right? And then I think there's the long-term vision and thinking of, okay, well, what is going to be the new normal, and how can we prepare for that new normal today, right? And we've got to approach that without fear. And the example that I like to share with people and a lot of the recruiters is that don't look at, for example, taking your on-site internship experience, going remote, as just a short-term solution. Look at it as creating a new tool in your toolbox. And so I'm seeing some questions from, you know, universities and career center professionals, and I would give them the same sort of advice and hopefully maybe inspire them to think about this moment as step one is, you know, support your students through this experience. It sucks for everyone, we know that, and they need all the support that we can provide them right now. But then just along with that is, when you imagine like what you're doing today, how does this become a part of your toolbox? How does this become, you know, something that you can turn to and leverage with or without, you know, the pandemic in the back of your mind? And so that's sort of like the push that I would give is, what does the other side look like? Let's prepare for that today. Let's add these new tools to our toolbox so we can leverage them in better times.
That's right.
Yeah, I completely agree with what you're both saying. But to add one to Christine's, I think the large enterprises, they've been doing this for 2 years already. They just have hit it really well. Many of our, I think one of the big tech companies that has been utilizing Yellow for almost a decade now, they'll still show up and kind of have a booth at a university career fair because they almost have to. They've got to pay. There's a fees associated with it. But the reality is, as soon as they get every single student in front of them, they are talking about some event that they're hosting offsite that is specifically about their organization, where they are providing an experience that the other companies can't. And so I think the biggest concern I have is, and again, I know Yellow primarily supports large enterprise companies, but I would look at university career centers of helping them get more of the small and medium businesses to be able to be on the same playing field. Because I think it's going to be super tough when companies already have really robust workflows, really robust virtual solutions, that they'll be able to continue doing it. We pulled up 131 of our customers just over the last 2 days and said, like, are you thinking about the fall? Are you worried about it? Are you trying to figure out the strategy? Over 70% of them, they already knew the strategy and they knew how they were going to conduct it. And this not being able to go to campus, it's not the worst thing in the world. And they've got a strategy around it. And it could be using sourcing solutions like, Handshake or Piazza or whoever else they're looking at different components. But when it comes down to it, who offers the best workflow, the best experience, and something that is unique, they're the ones that'll continue to win the top talent.
Yeah, I'll just chime in there. I'll get more tactical this time with my answer. I think we have definitely in our conversations, and I've been in on some of these conversations directly myself, with employers that are both really large enterprise, Jason, as you sort of mentioned, the kind of Fortune 500, Fortune 100 that most people are thinking about, but also some mid-size and smaller companies. And there has been a desire for many to actually shift towards virtual for some time. Many have, to your point, have already been creating sort of virtual strategy teams that have been focused on sort of what digital recruitment and digital engagement could sort of look like even before COVID. And what we're hearing from a lot of those employers is that COVID simply accelerated a trend that they were quite interested in moving towards for a long time. And I think a loss I would say often when I'm talking to our university partners, there's sometimes a misnomer that the reason that is happening is because they're trying to cut corners, when in reality, it's not just about that. In fact, it's often not about cutting corners. It's about diversifying their applicant pool. And I know this is another topic that I'm quite passionate about. I know Wahab and Farouk, you guys have also sort of spoken to and written about issues of access and equity. But I think as we continue to look at what this pandemic is doing, we're going to see virtual engagement actually increase. And I do think that there's a large portion of virtual engagement that's going to stay. From a very practical level, employers that have already started to shift and train all of their recruiters to do virtual engagement, they're not going to want to just suddenly change all of that and revert back to what that is going to look like. And I think for university career centers, one question that I've been asking employers is, in this shift, what value do you see for university career centers? What value do they offer you as an employer? What does that look like now as things are shifting, right? And the answers vary, to be perfectly honest. You know, some still think about it from a connection standpoint. Some think about it from an access standpoint. Many would actually really like it if you can be a little bit more curated around what that means, not from curation of jobs to your students. That's not the kind of curation they're looking for. They're looking for curated information that they can't get, knowledge about your culture, about your campus, about thinking through how the employer can actually still directly connect with the students in some of those ways. And to see the Career Center as a really informative piece, but not as one that is a gatekeeper, if you will. And it was very interesting to hear the perspectives of some of those employers as they recognize there are many career centers that are not trying to do that, but there are still some that I think see their role as that, and they're trying to help shift them because they want to work with them. They don't want to go around them. And we know, I know I had just posted last week, and it seemed to get a lot of traction, but we know from our students, 99% of them want help from their career centers right now. And it's scary when institutions are looking at budget cuts and they're trying to figure out where are they going to save. And I think career education is specifically one of those areas that you should not be cutting. It's an area that is going to give your institution value. It's going to show your return on investment. It's incredibly important that you're actually investing in that area right now, rather than taking away from. But I do think it's incumbent then on career services to actually rethink the way in which you are showing your value and having impact. You can't do things kind of same old, and expect your institution to still value or resource you in the same way. And so I think it's sort of incumbent on all of us to be thinking about how do our roles change, and how do we get comfortable with what those changes are going to look like in collaboration with each other, because we each play a very critical piece to sort of this equation.
You are correct, and I want to add, and I know you've alluded to it, I just want to say it in support of what you're saying, but perhaps a little bit differently. Career education should not be on the budget cutting floor only if it adds value, not only just showing value, but also adds value. I know you mean that too.
Yeah.
I want to make sure that our audience hears it clearly, that it's not about just showing you value on campus. You have got to reinvent yourself in order to truly add value. Here are a couple of things that have been, I think, part of the general criticism of career services offices in higher education. These are not my criticism, it's criticism that you've heard from your alumni, students, your administration, your board of trustees, etc., is that we don't go far enough in building the connection part, you know, and truly building the pipeline. We have stayed in our corners of advice giving, listening, supporting, doing all of the things that we ought to do. I am not saying we should stop doing those, but we've been, Christine and I have written 2 articles or a couple of articles about this in the last 10 years, that the shift in higher education needs to move towards building connections and making those networks for students more robust. So I even tweeted recently and put it on also on LinkedIn, using the data that Handshake published, that actually it has to be the responsibility of every single career services officer that before they let go of their group of students or their individual students who's meeting with them, that you actually build a connection for them with a mentor who is an alum, or a couple of them, or an employer, and you get them started, and then they launch from there. because typically that's where the expectation starts for the students and their families. That they're coming to us to help expand their networks. And we usually stop, unfortunately, at the advice giving and at pointing them to websites and to platforms and giving them homework to do. We should do all of those, but also we should do the connection. There's a second thing that I think we have an opportunity to shift into. I'll just say this, and that sounds like you want to react to what I just said. So I'll definitely, I'm interested in hearing that. The second thing that we have a moment now in doing is that these students are at a moment of deep reflection. We've all wanted them to be in this moment where they ask themselves, what do I do now? And we have an opportunity to actually help them design their lives and their careers moving forward. This can be viewed as the ideal opportunity for students to prototype their wildest and most outrageous ideas, whether it's a startup or a nonprofit organization, or a book that they want to read or write, or a piece of music that they want to compose, or a code that they want to write, or join an organization that's already doing some type of work, or create a blog, or I don't know, start a vision chat like this. So what is your prototype, and build it, and then test it out, using design thinking methodology, and actually design your life. This is the time to do it. These students, for the most part, are at home. They have a future that is uncertain, and they're not sure where to go from here. So in addition to connecting them and to helping them consider alternatives, this is a moment where we can engage them also in life design. Let me pause here and just see if that generates any reactions.
Yeah, so I have been dealing and working with career services now for 22 years, and then my time at Miami University in Ohio. And when I think about the role there of logistics and advice versus when I started working with law school programs, and I started working with MBA programs, which are really more like outplacement and outcome focused. I think it's an opportunity for university career centers to make sure that they're getting the funding that they actually need to start providing outcomes. There's a wonderful, this was a quote from the editor of the Washington Post for many, many years. And it's the answer to all your questions are money. And so when you think about the revenue that is coming into the universities, it's coming primarily from students and from foundational giving. And so if you think of the outcomes for these students at the undergraduate level, career centers should be part of that marketing package. And it should be really focused on what outcomes they can help do. And I think if you're able to position yourselves during this time, and I urge you to do that, and we'll help you if you need help with those business cases, because we have great outcomes data provided by these companies. You have an opportunity to design something really interesting to perhaps shift budget. There are foundational giving, like one of the features in yellow is tracking foundational giving, right? We have companies, to Wahab's point, that are trying to help influence faculty. They're trying to help influence different types of coursework. Like, let's utilize that, and let's really bring university career centers back to an outcome-focused organization where they are properly funded, where they are able to go out and build lots of connections and help place the next generation of leaders.
Absolutely. So,
I think
Christine.
Sorry, go ahead, Farouk. You go first.
Christine, no, actually, it's a question for you also. So say what you want to say, but also try to help people understand the difference between what we're saying and the placement model, because I think people are wondering about that. You and I see it with clarity, and I think Wahab and Jason too, but and many people in our audience. But I think there are some who are not sure what the difference is.
Sure. Okay, so I'm going to tackle this. I'm going to tackle two different things, because I also want to say one piece to what you were saying before, Farouk, which is, I think part of the reason why there's critique on career centers, particularly from senior administrators or those on the board that may or may not fully understand what the purpose or the value of career services can be is because we speak different languages. And there's such importance in making sure that we align on the way in which we talk about the work that we do. Internally, we have a lot of jargon and a lot of lingo about how we talk about the purpose of meaningful work and what we care to be able to help our students explore and discover. That is all great. That doesn't necessarily need to shift in terms of purpose, but the language in which you are using, you're talking to CEOs or CFOs of companies that are serving on your institution's board. You're talking to presidents who may come from faculty. They don't speak the same language. So we have to be adept code switchers. We have to understand the way in which they understand the world, and we have to be able to package what it is we do so that they can understand what that value looks like. I also think a huge piece of sort of the struggle with some centers and some institutions is that we don't talk about our work and we don't approach our work as a business. And the reality is all institutions are businesses. And many of them are obviously realizing that right now as they go through this pandemic and they figure out their finances and they figure out what that all looks like. Well, career centers are individual mini businesses within a larger conglomerate, essentially, right? And so when you think about the resources that you're given as a director, you should also be thinking about, I have X number of students that I need to be able to serve. I have X number of resources that I have. And so based on that, how am I going to allocate my resources most appropriately so that I can actually achieve the largest reach possible? And how do I think about what it is I'm doing so that people actually come back, right? If you were a business and your customers don't return next year, or they don't keep coming back to use your product, you're going to go out of business. And so it's sort of the same thing with your students. If you're not providing value to them in a way that they need it, they're not going to come back. So why should you continue to get funded, right? And so I'm going to use that actually as a segue to what Farouk was talking about in terms of how is what he's saying different from or similar to sort of the former placement model that many career centers or many career professionals that have been in the field for a long time are familiar with. I think it's a little bit of a hybrid, to be perfectly honest. I think the reality is the students that we serve now, and we know this through the data that has changed over the past 5 to 10 years from our institutions, we've seen an increase in low income, first gen students of color, right? That is a fundamentally different student population that we are serving right now than what higher education was first created to serve. There are systems that do and don't work for our large population of students that are growing. So when we think about that and we think about educating our students, I'm all about teaching our students how to fish. I feel like that's probably one of those analogies that our field loves to use the most. And I'm not saying that that's not true. Yes, teach the students how to fish, but you might also need to like literally take them fishing, put the worm on the hook, help them throw it into the water and teach them how to reel that back in, right? And that's not giving the fish away, but it is literally walking through the steps of that. Because the reality is when you wanna connect your students to their networks, some students literally don't have any networks, like none whatsoever. And they don't know what it looks like to make that connection. So for you, you are their connection. Career services is their connection. And if you can give them an opportunity to make that introduction to an employer or to an alum and say, this is a student I've been working with, he or she has really been working on X, Y, and Z. They've been growing this skill. I'd like to facilitate a quick introduction. I'll let you two take it from here, right? All you've done is simply giving them a stepping stone to make that a little bit easier. And so I think a lot of, Farouk, you actually did a little Q&A as a post on as part of your comments to what you had talked about on LinkedIn. And I think you answer a lot of those particular questions, but I don't think it's an either or. I think it can be a both and as you look at those pieces. And I think this is also where technology can partner to be able to help scale that reach, because I know not everybody has the resources to be able to do that in terms of people power.
Indeed, very
Sorry, I'm really passionate about that.
very powerful. What have you looked like? You have something.
Well, I mean, I think like I'm super passionate about this, and I love Christine's point about like a lot of students literally don't have these networks and connections, and the university that they attend, the institute of higher education that they're a part of, like that is their network, that is their connection. And you know, I obviously, like, I worked in higher education. I worked in employer relations at Stanford University and Carnegie Mellon University. And, you know, I never viewed my role, and, you know, obviously, like, Farouk can speak to this a little bit, but the way we were we were organized, I never viewed my role as a one-to-one type of relationship in terms of, hey, here's one student, let me connect you with an employer that I have. I always viewed myself as a lighthouse, right? So I wanted to make sure that I could reach as many students as possible, that by my work, they had exposure and opportunity to connect with as many employers as possible, and the reverse as well being true. How can I connect with as many employers as possible and create as much exposure for them on whatever campus it is that I'm serving? I think your point that you ended with in terms of like resources are scarce is a valid one. But if University Career Services look at themselves as more of a lighthouse and a platform, rather than sort of something that's not as scalable in terms of those one-to-one. So I think what I'm trying to say is that we should be thinking about this more as, how can I create the systems? How can I create the platforms where those one-to-one connections happen frequently and at scale, right? So rather than trying to figure out how I can impact 10 students in my sort of day-to-day, how can I build a system that impacts 500 students? How can I build a system that impacts all of the liberal arts or all of the English majors on my campus? Like, that's how I believe the University Career Service should be thinking about it. And then I also have an issue with just the terminology of career services. Like, I believe we're talking about talent development and talent exploration and connections. Like career, I'm maybe 10 years into my career. I still need support and mentorship, and I don't know what I'm going to do tomorrow, right? And so we're talking to 18 to 21, 22-year-olds and talking about like this long-term thing of like your career. Like, let's think about like, how do you develop your talent, and what opportunities, what companies are going to be the best pathway forward. We all know that the average tenure for new grads at a company is less than 18 months. Right. And this is some of the stuff that we're seeing at URX in terms of cross-company collaboration, is companies are starting to realize that when I hire somebody, it's really not about sort of the here and now, it's about increasing the talent pool. Right. So obviously I predominantly work in tech, and companies in tech are now starting to realize that, if Yellow hires a student today, a new grad today, they're probably going to be working at Handshake in 18 months. And the student at Handshake hired is going to be working at Yellow in 18 months. So why don't Yellow and Handshake work together to increase the overall number of students that are coming into their talent pool, the type of talent that they're looking for and trying to hire? And I think there's an opportunity there for universities to support that and be the platform that engages, makes that happen at scale.
This is really, really exciting, and I wish I could spend 3 hours with you. I mean, I feel like we just got going. There's so much to talk about when we talk about the future. I want to end it on one action verb that you would want everybody to apply in order to move towards the future. One direction, one directive, and I'll get us started with mine to give you a little bit of time to talk to just talk really briefly about it, because we're at the end of the hour. Mine is reinvent, and reinvent is not only for career centers or universities, employers, companies, tech companies that are in between like yours, or students or alumni. I mean, I think this is a moment for people to reinvent, and the ones who will lose out of this moment, who will fall behind, are the ones who are simply responding and waiting for the storm to pass so that they can go back to past behaviors and past practices, or the ones who are trying to figure out how to tweak past practices and previous models to make them fit into this new world that we're in. You have a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to completely rip the thing apart and rebuild it with an entirely new vision. So if you are, for example, a career services office, and your previous model was service delivery, what is the model of the future? And rebuild your team that way. Budget cuts will be an opportunity for you to do that, not a hindrance. How you manage your revenues, because there were some questions about revenues and revenue flows from career fairs, is an opportunity for you to reinvent the entire process. How you engage with tech companies that are in between, like Handshake, Yellow, and URX community and others, and how you engage with industry. And same thing for recruiters, but especially for students. This is the chance for you to reinvent yourself, to design your life, to create that prototype. So I think if you choose the word reinvent as your guiding principle for the next 3 to 6 months, you will find yourself way ahead of the crowd, and you will find yourself in a model that actually produces better outcomes for you than in the past. What's yours? Who wants to start? Who's got a big word?
I'll go next, since mine is actually rather similar to yours. Mine is create. There's no reason for you to not create the future that you want. And so now's the time to go do it.
Great. Jason.
Imagine that there are hyphens here. So it's all one word, and it's action, and it's a verb. But experiment and go. And so there may be old things that become new again. There may be things that are tried and true that you want to stick with. But like, don't worry about failing. Experiment, fail, pivot, keep going. But just go for it. And I really urge you, there's a huge opportunity right now. And I'd love to see people take more risks and experiment.
Very good. And Wahab, you get the last word.
Yeah, I mean, I think mine would be build. No matter where you fall in terms of the audience, whether you're career services, whether you're employee relations, counselors, recruiters, higher ed professionals, students, it's build. Build for the future and also build for the here and now. People need to, all the points that were made were great. I think we need to think about that short term. What do you need to build today to get you to tomorrow? And what can you build today that will give you success tomorrow? And really just think of it in that way.
Fantastic. Hey, I loved my conversation with you today. This was a true vision chat. We talked about the future in ways that I'm not sure I've talked about it before. I love the three of you. I love all of our audience members who participated today. Please join us for future vision chats at Johns Hopkins. I'm working diligently to get us some amazing panelists and people who can join the conversation. And we look forward to seeing you all in the future. Good luck to all of you. Thank you so much, Christine, Wahab, and Jason, for joining us. And have a wonderful time. And thank you so much for all you do for college students, especially for our industry, for higher education, and for companies. You do a tremendous amount of work, and I want to publicly thank the three of you and all of the other companies that help out in this fashion. Have a wonderful day, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Stay safe.
Bye, everyone.